Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Crysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Hey everybody, and thanks for joining me on another solo episode of the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. Today I want to dive into KPI reports. What is a KPI report? I want to get into the difference between reports and dashboards, and I also want to help, even though I've written some other articles about this, I want to help kind of unpack the difference between leading and lagging indicators, how those are beneficial, how we can utilize those within a report and dashboard, and even get into a couple of examples here in terms of, how we can build these and why they're useful, depending on, obviously the context of your organization and size and scope, all of those fun things. So let's kind of dive in. First and foremost, what is a KPI report? For those of you who are not familiar with this, right, this is simply a structured way of, kind of tracking progress against your goals, right? KPIs, key performance indicators, being able to tell the story through data. And in a report fashion, typically that's going to be delivered to senior leadership, C-suite, board, directors, ownership. Again, depending on your org structure is where this stuff ultimately goes. But think of this as, again, telling the story of the business through your lens, right? Depending on where you sit in the org structure. And how wide your responsibilities are, but telling the story of the business through the data in this report. So where I see a lot of folks, kind of go wrong, right, is one, really getting in depth with this, and while that may be required, again, large organizations, board oversight and governance, all of those kinds of things, for most people, non-publicly traded companies, privately held companies, smaller organizations, right? One facility or location, even maybe up to 5 or 10 facilities or locations. We can simplify this, and the whole goal here, again, I keep coming back to this theme, but is to tell the story of the business, what is happening through the lens of data, in this consolidated view, right? Oftentimes, the folks that are getting these reports are not kind of out and about and seeing KPI boards or dashboards, any of those things. You can certainly build a dashboard view of these things that these folks can access. But again, oftentimes, it's kind of great practice to summarize that in a KPI report that is just delivered on kind of an auto basis. So that's what it is. What are some examples? So we can think through maybe a rev gen team, right? What would a KPI report look like for somebody that is responsible for revenue generation, right? This is where we can start to unpack some of the differences between leading and lagging indicators. So, first off, we have to identify, well, what are the KPIs that we want to use? So again, you've got lagging indicators, which are going to be things that have already happened. So if we're talking about, rev gen teams, this is going to be, what was the revenue, right? Like pretty simple. If we're talking about leading indicators, this is where it kind of gets super interesting. And again, depends on the cadence of the report and, how all of this comes to be. That's why there's not, some specific, roadmap or template to follow, right? This is very telling the story of your business through the lens of data and, your responsibilities. But when it comes to the leading indicators of things. Like on the RevGen side, that could be, phone calls taken, quotes generated or entered. That can be, follow-ups done, or customer touches, prospect touches, all of these different kinds of, things that may lead us down the path of saying, well, history tells us that on months we've produced X in revenue. We started, right? We started the top of that pool with, this much inbound activity. That's, phone calls, emails, quote opportunities, all of those types of things. So again, depends on if we're talking about leading or lagging, KPIs, how we want to build out the story of the business for this specific report. That's one example. If we want to talk more about the operation side of things, you could do the same thing here, right? So it's, what do we produce, right? What was our throughput? How many orders did we ship? What was our, kind of overall effectiveness? All of those types of things, on-time shipments, right? So those would all be examples of lagging indicators, things that already happened. We're just, delivering the news, versus leading indicators in that pool of things, right? That could be defects found. That could be, machinery uptime, right? Like all of these things that would let us do a bit of forward looking to say, what's the likelihood of being able to achieve what we've achieved in the past? So that's the value of trying to define leading indicators versus solely relying on lagging indicators. Now, traditionally, KPI reports are going to basically be full of lagging indicators. It's just, hey, here's what happened. Here's delivering the news. Where there becomes some real value in these, again, is identifying some of those leading indicators to be able to hopefully forecast where we're going to land. Right now, you can argue the effectiveness with which you can predict. And so therefore, typically you can't get too far of a prediction ahead. But depending on the business, depending on the data integrity that we have, depending on the things that we're tracking, right? You could get monthly, quarterly. I've even seen it, out to the half to be pretty close in terms of predicting, where are we going to be in terms of revenue and profitability? Where are we going to be in terms of, customer credits, or, all of these different things that kind of, again, bubble up into, the bigger categories. So, those are all things that ultimately, you need to define when you are building out these KPI reports. Now, a lot of times these are already well established, and maybe you're coming into an organization that has this and you're just kind of taking over. If that's the case, I would highly encourage you to, kind of challenge the notion. And the reason that you want to do this is because, what's the value? That's ultimately what we're trying to unpack here. What's the value of putting this information together and delivering it in a report? How do we make it actionable? What do we do with this? We don't just want to deliver the news. We want to be able to, kind of predict and ultimately influence or prevent, right? Depending on what we're talking about, something from happening. Right? So that's the real value of this. But to get to that point, you have to start with a much bigger and broader question. It's not down in the weeds of, how does this look, and do we include this chart versus, just the raw data types of things. It's really about asking ourselves, like, what are the KPIs that are really going to drive results here? What problems are we seeing, and how do we tie a KPI to that problem, to those results ultimately, right, that we're seeking? And then again, another step further here, who owns that? Who owns that KPI? Who's going to be held accountable? Who's going to be responsible for that? How do we empower them, give them the tools and support to influence the results of that, specific KPI, right? So You can look at it from the from the lens again, like from a strategic perspective, from a purely operational perspective, or again from kind of more of an analytical perspective. So all of that is stuff that kind of goes into designing what a KPI report could be, should be, how valuable and useful it is for your particular organization. And you know I'm always a fan of kind of pushing back and saying, especially if you're coming into an organization that, this is an established practice. Again, depends on structure, right? Like, always depends. But just sharing some different perspectives here. But pushing back on the notion that, we need to do this, right? Because again, ultimately, you're trying to say, like, what's the value in doing this? This takes resource. If you're not getting value out of aggregating this data and sharing it with somebody, and it's not presented in a way that is actionable so we can influence a outcome, I say, what's the point, right? Like that might not be a popular stance, but I think that's what we should be striving for, right? If we're not moving the needle, what's the point, right? If we're not solving a problem that our customers are facing or that we've heard from them, like, what's the point? Okay. It doesn't do us any good in terms of how do we build sustainable business. It doesn't do us any good as business leaders to increase efficiency for ourselves if it's not also then impacting that customer experience. Because what happens over the course of time, right, is that that customer experience goes down. We maybe see a small bump in terms of efficiency, which will typically translate out into maybe another percentage point in profitability, maybe a couple, depending on how inefficient or how ineffective it is. But you have to balance that, because if we're only seeking efficiency within our organization, and more often silos within that organization, then typically what I see is customer experience suffering at the kind of hands of these decisions that are being made, i.e., dropping, profitability. So it's like, hey, revenue's down, profitability percentage, is up. A lot of people would say, hey, amazing, but we have to dig deeper, right? This is one tool that can help you actually do that by pushing back on this notion that we're just delivering the news versus seeking to understand how we can influence and ultimately deliver, drive value back out to to the customer, right? Again, without customers, we have no business, right? We have no opportunity to become more profitable, to increase cash flow without the revenue side. So it all works together. But again, getting back to KPI reports, and it's important to know too. I did not really cover this. I did quickly, but in terms of like the difference between this report and dashboard, right? Typically, dashboards are going to live, at kind of that middle management layer and lower. Where people are going to own that data, it's going to be aggregated and then displayed for folks. And again, it could be digital, could be manual, could be shared in stand-ups, could be on a whiteboard, could be emailed, right? Like typically not in a dashboard setting, but could be. Could show up on operators councils, right? Could be on iPads, or PC terminals. So again, a variety of ways to deliver and disseminate that information. The big difference being, between dashboards and reports, typically that report, again, is going to be the story of the business. So there's going to be some more context. There's typically going to be, maybe some follow-up or action items or summary based upon what we see. That's typically what you're going to see in a KPI report that, again, is going to bubble up into senior leadership, ownership, C-suite, so on and so forth, right? So how do we actually build one of these things? I kind of already started to outline a bit of this, but, first and foremost, right, gotta define the goal, right? Like, what are we doing here? Why are we doing this? How is this going to help lead to the greater good? Next, critical, choosing the right KPIs. Now, again, what I would see in a lot of scenarios is that we have more KPIs than we really need. More, especially in this scenario, more is not always better. Sometimes it's confusing. Sometimes there's, the old too many cooks in the kitchen, right? Especially in a scenario where we haven't kind of given somebody ownership over that specific, KPI and the ability to influence the outcome of that. Now, opposite side, where I've seen this really become beneficial is it actually increases cross-functional communication and collaboration, which is amazing, right? That doesn't always happen, but that is the opposite side of it, right? So it's like finding that happy balance of what do we need to measure? Is it leading? Is it lagging? How do we utilize that to influence outcome? And again, what's the greater good of how we deliver value back to the customer? Those are the most important points out of all of this. Step number 3, like, how do we actually get the data, right? This can be easily overlooked because it's no big deal, right? So you want to be mindful of, is this something that we need to measure long-term, right? So what's the system we're going to utilize to capture that data, report out on that data, so on and so forth, versus is this something more temporary? Do we see this trending up and we need to get a handle on it? Do we need to just get some more visibility over this specific situation? For that, I love legal pad, right? Like tally sheets, quick Google Sheet, Excel template, right? Whatever it is, something quick, something that, there's not a lot of friction to do, something that doesn't take, IT infrastructure and a bunch of approvals. It's like, hey, we need to get visibility on this thing. Here's how we're going to do that, right? You can look at it daily, you can look at it weekly, you can look at it monthly, you can, collaborate and disseminate all of that information in stand-ups and so on and so forth. So, how do we collect and organize what we want to look at? Is it long-term? Is it temporary? Now it's like, well, how do we deliver this, right? So in that scenario, I like to find who are we delivering it to, right? Like, what kind of level of detail do we need to add to this thing to tell a cohesive story and for them to understand without having to come back, to the report creator? What are we doing, right? Like, what's going on? That's the whole point of, trying to share this, right? So again, designing the report, speaking to, what kind of information they want to see. How do we best contextualize that? And then everything, right? Like review, refine, repeat, right? Like continuous improvement, understanding. Is this something we still need to continue to do? Has something changed with the structure? Do we need to refine our leading and lagging indicators? All of those things are up for interpretation, which is, again, why I say if you're coming into an organization that already has this in place, best question is who does what with this, right? Why are we doing it? How does this help influence outcomes for us? Is there anything that's missing? All of those types of questions become super relevant and really, really valuable, for folks that are doing this stuff. So, as always, I want to remind you that every one of the solo episodes of the Everyday Business Problems podcast is an extension of our weekly Business System Saturday newsletter. It's free to sign up. I send it out, 9:30-ish Eastern time every Saturday morning. I hope you sign up. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll catch you on the next episode. Thanks so much. Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Crysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Crysler.